Sorry, there's a... Welcome once again to another property live stream. This is the second, or is it? My goodness, it's got so quickly from us. The third of this week's 4 property live streams. Tomorrow's, of course, Cladding Matters from 1:00 p.m. May I introduce to you my podcast partner, Hamish McClay of Surgical Bay, and special guests, of course, Juliet Babulal of Gunner Cook LLP, our tame property lawyer, and Silas J. Lees of WikiWham, social commentator and very knowledgeable about what's actually going on in the property market and, more importantly, how it affects you. We discuss topics to hopefully incite a bit of critical thinking, a bit of discussion amongst you. If you feel like throwing sponges at the screen because we say something you don't like, that is the correct response. Now, today's topic, as ever, will affect a large number of you. When a firm closes overnight, and of course, to start us off, as ever, Hamish McClay.
Well, good morning to you all, and almost continuing what Gareth was speaking about as the week progresses. My wife told me first thing this morning, we have sunshine Saturday and snow on Sunday. Well, that's something to look forward to. Maybe we'll get something in between. It beats the heck out of all this rain that we've been having. Unfortunately, whatever the weather, there's nothing compared to the sort of situation that we have. Our weather is variable. We can't rely on it. And it was interesting enough, Gareth and I were speaking just before we came on air about consistency. And we would normally expect consistency and what goes on with sort of law firms. But it's not something which we're unfamiliar with, because we had a major disaster a couple of years back. And of course, we've just had a disaster this last sort of couple of weeks. And there are small companies where this happens pretty well sort of all the time with the margins. But this particular situation we've reached ourselves in with the PM law, it does impact on, I would guess, thousands of other people. And unfortunately, while certain matters we can unravel, we as individuals, if something goes marginally wrong, we can jump in and retrieve the situation. However, and I'm so pleased that we've got Juliet with us today, because she will be able to explain in much more depth the repercussions of what does happen in this particular sort of type of situation. But it is very, very difficult, and we do feel for those who are caught up, because people, all sorts of phases they're caught up in. And as I said, even parts of that can be retrieved quickly, but other parts, it can take months and months for the whole thing to be resolved.
Juliet, welcome to the show as ever. It seems to be that we are in a potential quagmire when businesses just close overnight.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, and the truth is, businesses don't close overnight. The people at the top know very well what's happening. It's just that they choose not to trickle the information down. I mean, whether people think, if it's a financial thing, they might think, look, we're going to get a bailout, like you had with Debenhams and some of these other people that you thought were in administration. And so they could then, continue trading. But with law firms, I mean, the problem is scenario where someone's given their money, their deposit or their money, their final proceeds to purchase a property. They're expecting to move in the next day, and all of a sudden they keep calling the solicitor's firm. There's no answer. What do you do? Because one of the things that does happen is that the solicitor's client account gets intervened. So there's no movement of money at that point. If a firm is being intervened by the Law Society or the Solicitors Regulation Authority, there's no movement on those monies. So you have firms that have had intervention, and a load of people's monies are just caught in this sort of freezing injunction type scenario, so it can't be moved. I mean, my advice to the consumer is, look, don't panic. What you need to do in a situation like this is, whether it's solicitors, accountants, whoever, look to see who these people's regulatory bodies are. So the SRA, for example, has a helpline, a hotline. You call them and find out what exactly is happening. What are your next steps? Surely, if it's a purchase scenario, the solicitors on the seller's side should understand that this is happening. They themselves can vet or corroborate the information, so they know that you're not telling tales. It's not that you haven't come up with the money. It really is an intervention scenario. And usually with an intervention with solicitors, there's another firm that's appointed to act or to step in as trustees. So your point of contact will be with those individuals. So it's important to sort of be logical. And I think when it comes to house purchases, for example, you're already so much emotionally invested that when you're told the next day, you can't complete, you might be homeless potentially because you put all your eggs in one basket. Your savings are in there. You can't speak to the solicitor that you're used to speaking to because they aren't able to speak to you. So, that the natural human inclination is to panic at that point. And my point is, look, panicking is not going to help. The solution is find out who the regulatory body is with solicitors. It's the SRA. Call them. They normally have these measures in place to help. I mean, but we're looking at it from the consumer side. I've had people say to me they went off on maternity, paternity leave. They've come back and their firm has been intervened because a senior partner has done something untoward. He's under investigation and the whole firm's been shut down. So imagine you don't have a job. The next day you roll in, you haven't got a job. Reputationally, it doesn't look good for a solicitor. So everyone gets affected in this chain. It's not just the consumer who's unable to transact, but it's also the people that have worked at a firm where the senior partners have chosen not to tell them because they do know there's a lot of paperwork involved in the intervention, so everyone gets involved. It sort of gets affected when this sort of thing happens.
Silas, firms seem to pop up and disappear all the time at the moment. It must be dreadfully upsetting for people either domestically or commercially.
Well, I think you're right, Gareth, and the impact on, depending upon what type of firm it is that closes, the impact could be particularly widespread. Now, the uniqueness around this particular scenario of PM Law closing, just to piggyback on what Juliet was saying, is the wider impact goes beyond the people at the top who may or may not have done something dodgy, which is why the firm's been intervened, the staff that have lost their job, which is, of course, unfortunate. Then you've got the consumer and then the suppliers to that law firm, such as search providers, for example, who have all put searches forward. They may not get paid. You've then got the wider impact of the ripple effect. And this is the thing that I'm particularly worried about, because I've seen estimates that suggest up to 30,000 transactions could be affected. Now, there's about 100,000 transactions that go on per month in the UK property market. That may or may not have a ripple effect to undermine the wider standing and slow down people's moves on a much wider scale than we're currently being told. And that's the thing that I'm quite concerned about. The closure of a firm, depending upon what it is, shouldn't really make so much of an impact. But when it's a law firm, especially when you've paid your life savings over, or you've expected a mortgage to be redeemed that hasn't, and now you're paying two mortgages, for example, those sort of scenarios are causing people very, very sleepless nights. And I've seen some of the commentary online in private Facebook groups where these scenarios are unfolding in real time, and the stress for the consumer is unbelievable because they just don't know what's happening. And they're trying to get answers, and it does seem like there's not quite a wall of silence, but the language that the regulatory bodies speak compared to the language of the consumer is vastly different, and so that interpretation piece, I think, needs some serious work to help consumers know exactly what is going on and when the likely matters of these transactions that are going on at the moment will be resolved.
It just seems to me that it can throw a spanner in the works of even small deals by the sheer level of uncertainty. It's uncertainty that throws people completely into a turmoil. And with all the mental health issues that's going around, the last thing you need is to be unsure of whether people who are supposed to be acting for you truly are. There's so many people being ghosted as well. It just seems to be just the tip of the iceberg. Not knowing what's happening when a law firm's been intervened is part of it, but it's all the extra stress.
Gareth, 1,000%. We've just done some research into the wider aspects of the housing market, and the problem that is going on at the moment is mental health is a massive crisis, not just for the consumer, but also for the professionals within the industry. And I'm pretty confident, which is why we've seen 13% of the conveyancing workforce walk out in, I think it was 2021 to 22. They just had enough. The pressure was too much. And the property professionals are setting themselves up for failure time and time again. There isn't, in my mind, real leadership in the conveyancing sector particularly, and that is having a knock-on impact all throughout the mental health of the estate agents and conveyancers themselves, as well as the consumer. If sales were set up right from day one, i.e. all the information was gathered at the point of marketing, everybody could start a lot faster in the sales process, and there'd be a less running around trying to balance 100, 200 files at any one time. And the fact that the law firms are saying that consumers won't pay more for conveyancing is an outright lie. People will pay if they can translate that to value. And if are saying to the public, look, ordinarily it's going to take you 6 months to exchange contracts, but I can do it tomorrow, but it's going to cost you X, Y, Z amount of money more, the consumer then has a choice to make. And can make that choice rather than I've instructed my solicitor I should exchange contracts next week, and it's 6 months later, and I still don't know what's happening. The breakdown in communication is vast.
Julia, I mean, this is going to sound like it's an allied subject, but Hamish and I have been talking long and hard about putting together sort of a health podcast, because the mental health issues that come about through insecurity and being unsure about what's really happening, because unless you're in the midst of it, unless you're the solicitor who's actually dealing with it, the domestic, the dweller may not know at all what's going on, and suddenly to find that ostensibly the rug's been pulled out from underneath it must throw people into complete confusion. And by the way, to people watching, and I see a whole bunch of you have tuned in from Twitter, that today's topic is when a business suddenly closes down. So what say you, Juliet?
Look, mental health is something across the board. It's not just the consumer. That the lawyers are, when we've got deadlines and we're being told, look, you have to do this. I mean, do things within certain timeframes. For example, back in the day, we used to have a TT cutoff time. I don't know if you remember this, Silas, but we had a cutoff time of 3 o'clock. So come Friday, 3 o'clock, you knew that was the end of it all. You didn't have to push, you didn't have to do. The cutoff time to send monies is no longer 3 o'clock. It goes beyond. So people are expecting completions to take place later and later in the day, and the pressure's on there. So the solicitor's under pressure to get it right. The solicitor's under pressure to communicate the information. The solicitor might just be a normal solicitor employed by a firm and not know what the senior partners are doing, not know what's happening at the top. So it's to me, there is very much sort of a movement towards the blame game here, and I don't think there's any one person to blame in this sort of thing. Perhaps we need to have checks and balances where if someone's paid their money into a solicitor's client account, there's a specific insurance that should that firm go bust overnight, then that person is guaranteed a return of their monies, or the intervening firm of solicitors acts very quickly. So the firm that's appointed by the Law Society to step in can act very quickly to put the consumer in the position that they should have been in had the firm not been shut down. But when you've got decision makers who don't understand process and don't understand ramifications of process, this is what happens. Because I can tell you, I'm qualified in other jurisdictions, and this does not happen. In Italy, when you buy a property, you go to a notary public. The notary stamps the documentation, the property is bought as is, so you can do all the investigations you want to do, but the onus is not on the solicitor, the lawyer, to do checks and balances. It's on the consumer to get certain reports in, but you own the property straight. As soon as you've got those funds from a mortgage funder or from your self-funded, that property belongs to you. It's stamped and it's belonged to you. So there is no sort of in-between process where I'm exchanging contracts and I run the risk of the firm that I've used going bust. So perhaps we as a nation need to look at what other jurisdictions are doing and saying, how do we sort of proof this process so that should this happen, because you can't say that a firm, with all that, we always talk about, look, who are the partners in the transaction? Do your research. You could go to, there's some really high profile firms, that everyone knows the names, they've gone bust because of things the senior partner has done.
Yeah.
So that you couldn't call that if you wanted to. So if you'd done your research, you went on, you got all the reviews and all the references and stuff, you would have gone to this firm and you still would have ended up in that position. The question is, we pay as lawyers, we pay the Law Society monies, membership fees, all of these things, which have gone up as a result of what other law firms have done, because there's something called it's like a sinking fund that we contribute monies to pay out when you've got situations like this. But the more firms that do these sorts of dodgy things or close overnight, the higher the fund becomes. So it is then a knock-on domino effect on all the other lawyers, other practicing lawyers. But the question is, if we're paying a regulatory body these sorts of fees, what are the regulatory body's obligations? What are we putting in place to prevent people, people's mental health from going awry? There was a lawyer 2 years ago. She jumped on some train tracks, killed herself, and the next day her firm just kind of put up an advert to recruit, a replacement. It's one of those things where if your life doesn't really matter,
Wow.
It's both sides of the coins, but it's people getting together and actually wanting to do something that changes the system and not being seen to do something, wasting a whole bunch of money, just have all these meetings and, nothing is achieved.
We've got a question in from a friend of the show, Christine Salbert, who first of all says, what a brilliant idea. But secondly, jumps in and says, does Law Society do due diligence on all their members? My goodness, and that's a heavyweight question.
When I qualified in 2003 in the West Indies and then re-qualified in the UK. And I had to go through lots of checks and balances, etc. And what I found, in the West Indies, you've got to have the highest A-level grades, you've got to go to the best universities, etc. Whereas in England, a lot of people just qualify and they get through the system. So the question is, what does the Law Society then need to do to vet who its members are? But even then, lawyers know how to lawyer. They don't know how to run businesses. And that's half the problem. So when the money starts rolling in and there's mismanagement of funds and there's mismanagement of how you run a business, that's the problem. So the intervention has to come in where the Law Society has enough resources that they can then, monitor their members across the board. However that is done. We used to have something called CPD courses that we would have to physically attend. Now it's all self-assessment. So now you are relying on members to actually tell you the truth that they've done the training that they're meant to do per year.
Wow.
So checks and balances, the Law Society needs to do more, but it's not just the Law Society. We as individuals have obligations as well. But when it all falls apart and you're not, the problem is when you're not prepared for it, it's like, a house of cards falling down, and it can have a really negative impact on the consumer to the point where, people are, mental depression and things like that, severe mental disease.
Wow.
And I don't think that's an exaggeration either.
No, I think you're probably on the money. I think, first of all, there's a lack of knowledge of all the moving parts in this whole thing. And secondly, nobody realizes the pressure that, for instance, lawyers are under to conform to a standard that so many others aren't meeting in the first place. Hamish, it seems to be a powder keg, really, all this.
Well, I think it's a powder keg that's always existed. We are actually sort of seeing now ramifications of this one, because this was a significantly large company that was actually sort of involved with it. And so the outward spread was really one of those very, very sort of complicated scenarios. And Juliet was sort of quite right. It's not just that immediate point of explosion which is important. It's the whole of the industry which is impacted upon. And I think it becomes even worse. You think about when we have these transactions, very rarely is an individual transaction. It's not one person buying, it's one person selling. What we do have is that sort of chain effect, because we speak about these chains. So there's all of those people who are involved in that particular sort of chain. It's the impossibility then of the chain moving at all. So all of those people are involved within that transaction. So how many people are actually caught up because of one single transaction? And as we actually sort of saying earlier, there could be a certain Silas, he came up with some numbers suggesting how many transactions there were in a month. But of course it's all multiplied in terms of who's involved. And I think we need to look at ways of capturing this. Strangely, I don't believe, with current circumstances and the way they like to go for the next 2 to 3 years, that this will be unusual, the situation. I think we'll actually see a bit more of it. Hopefully not in the same way that we saw PM Law, but there will, any company that's sort of working with very, very sort of narrow margins, where we have a situation like this. Now, I think the worst of it is, Juliet said, some people know what's going on within that company. And unfortunately, that information is not, like we're saying, the information, the explosion spreads outwards. Information does not spread out in the same sort of way relative to that. People don't know how to act. Even the likes of, for example, if you like, the regulators, would it be SRA, whether it be the Law Society themselves, even they need time to react to such a situation. So it's not something which unfolds very, very quickly, or is there a quick resolve. And I think the very, very worst impact of this is, how does it affect people? As Juliet says, and so often we hear this, people become emotionally involved with their transaction, but the professionals are emotionally involved as well. So it's a massive, great impact. And let's sort of hope we can find sort of ways of, perhaps not, we can't control the situation, but possibly we can find ways of finding solutions quicker than we are at the moment.
Wow. So, Juliet, you're saying there should be some sort of thing in place, an indemnity effectively to indemnify the whole thing. Silas says more people should be aware of how the process is run, so that perhaps they're more prepared for it. Hamish says, buyer beware, for goodness sake, do some due diligence of your own. And I say, surround yourself with decent people that you can rely on, who are consistent about this kind of approach, so that you know where you are at any point in the transaction. It's about finding the right people to work with. I think we've all banged that drum before. Once again, thank you so much, Hamish, for bringing this to us. Silas, for being with us, and Juliet Babula for your sage and excellent commentary and advice. And to all you out there, there's lots more to come. We're forever talking about these topics. Some of them are more emotional than others, but there's so much more to come. Do carry on being with us every Thursday at 10 o'clock when we discuss these topics. Don't forget, tomorrow at 1 o'clock, Cladding Matters. It should be a good old bun fight. There's lots of stuff coming. Please do tune in. But until then, keep your feet on the ground, keep reaching for the stars, and for goodness sake, do look after your mental health. Until next week, bye-bye.